From the peak of Saddle Butte to the depths of the LaPorte Slough, this is the Trent Klarenbach Podcast. Today I have an author, a grain farmer from Mundare, Alberta, Ken Motiuk. He wrote the book Culture of Control about his fight against the Canadian Wheat Board and how government institutions outlive their usefulness and end up being a detriment to industry. Ken, great to have you on today.
Good morning, Trent. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Yeah, this was great to finally connect. And I read your book. I encourage everyone to read your book. I'll put a link to your book in the show notes. And Culture of Control. And yeah, that was an interesting book. It really, really resonated with me. I found the Canadian Wheat Board is a real struggle for me when I was farming, and you're a big part of reducing our dependence on it. So how did you get started with that?
Well, this all happened when, first of all, my background is I'm a Ukrainian. My family came from Ukraine in 1899 and settled in Alberta, right in Mundare, where we still are on the land that was homesteaded. And they came seeking freedom and the ability to express themselves. They had land taken away by the Russians and the Austrians for years. They were just serfs there. So anyway, my grandfather farmed, my father farmed, my family farmed. I enjoyed the farm. I was encouraged to go to university. I took agriculture, and I came back to the farm in the mid 70s, and with a whole bunch of new ideas. I mean, we were in that Ukrainian area, very, very risk averse, people that were not always the most confident in an Anglo society, so to speak. And they had their own norms and cultures and ways of doing things. And frankly, by the 70s, their farming techniques were getting rather regressive. After going to university and meeting a bunch of people and that, I came home and said, okay, it's time to get this thing straightened out. We don't need to summer fallow anymore. It's time we started putting nitrogen. We got to spray that wild oats out of the crops. Well, that didn't go over that easily, but I convinced my dad we were going to try it. And that required a lot of cash up front because all of a sudden your fertilizer costs are higher, your herbicide costs, your fuel, you didn't have the summer fallowing, but it also presented a lot of opportunity. So we grew all this grain, we have more grain to sell, and all of a sudden we realized we can't sell it anymore. And this is the mid to late 1970s. The Russian great grain robbery that had occurred in the early 1970s. It's a book or a story I would encourage everybody to read because it provides a great background. Had basically purchased up all the surplus supplies of grain in North America. So we had tremendous markets for grain in Canada, but we couldn't get our crops to market. And we needed money. I just convinced my dad to spend all this money on inputs. And he's saying, see, you can't sell the grain. We don't have quota for it. So I'm not one who easily bows to authority. I start figuring out what's the problem here. Well, you start digging and you see, well, there is the wheat board. Well, the wheat board has quotas and they have control. And at the time in 1970, there was great inflation. There were strikes at the West Coast. The railroads hadn't been reinvesting in facilities. The grain companies hadn't been building new elevators. Why? Well, we had the old crow rate, which forced the railroads to haul grain at rates that were set in the 1890s. Now, you can sit there and say, well, they got all this land and they got the minerals and all this stuff. They should pull grain for 19 or 1899 rates. Well, they were only getting 20 cents on the dollar. Don't kid yourself. They're not going to pull grain. They're going to do the minimal they have. So the system was dysfunctional. Nobody had been investing money in facilities. You dig deeper and you find out, well, why weren't they? Well, the wheat board, a government body with no investment in the system, controlled all the movement of grain through the assets. They controlled how much grain you sold, when you sold it, where you sold it, when it got shipped, to who it got shipped, what terminals it went through. And we couldn't get things done. So as we started digging deeper, I started to see that it was the wheat board was the main culprit in all of this. And I started on my mission to try and get some freedom for farmers.
Yeah, interesting. Your story is very similar to mine, but just preceded me by a couple decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, introducing new technologies, new type of farming,
Uh,
the headwinds experienced with that,
yeah.
and obviously there was the cash flow component to it, which was always important in a business, right?
Correct.
And then, yeah, actually, I had when I was farming, thinking, I talked about this. I've mentioned this before in the past. My podcast is, I was a young farmer and I could not grow any wheat board crops. It wasn't I just couldn't cash flow my business. I could not
Correct.
operate my farm that way. And it wasn't helping a young farmer in the late 90s, early 2000s.
That's right.
Who was it helping?
So, well, it was a an entrenched bureaucracy interested in self-preservation, is what it comes down to. So, my mission started in 1979. My member of parliament out in Mundare was Don Mazinkowski, who was from Veggerville. I knew him. So, in 1979, I wrote him a long letter when he became minister under the Joe Clark government, Minister of Transport in the Canadian Wheat Board. I wrote him a long letter saying, essentially boiling down to, until you do two things, Western grain industry isn't going to flourish. You got to start paying the railroads for moving grain, or they're not going to invest. And B, you got to do something about the wheat board's total control and give some farmers some freedom in selling grain. So that was 1979. I was then offered a job in his office in Ottawa. So we went to Ottawa. And of course, we didn't stay very long because Joe Clark miscounted on the budget vote in December of 79. And in February of 80, we had the Trudeau Liberals back again. So anyway, I came back to we came back to the farm. There was my wife and our eldest daughter were born at the time. And anyway, over time, I worked in a number of places. I worked in ministers' offices. I worked in the Grain Transportation Authority. I worked on advisory bodies in the Alberta government called the Alberta Grain Commission. I later became elected as a director of United Grain Growers. So all of a sudden, I was into the grain industry in Winnipeg. And then I finished my career. I was appointed by Stephen Harper to the Canadian Wheat Board, and after the 2012 Act of Parliament to change the Wheat Board, I was one of the 5 board members that was appointed to wind it down. So, and in between were the journeys and the town meetings where you were hooted out of town because you talked about paying the railroads and dare you question the Wheat Board. But there were a lot of us. There was a large group of people, and I've mentioned a number of them in the books that had just had it. And we found over and over that the old system wasn't working. It didn't adapt. Yes, there was a time when the Wheat Board and that system worked better. I mean, in the 1920s, you were a farmer. You woke up at 4 in the morning and you fed the horses and did the chores and hooked up the sleigh and came to the house for breakfast. Then spent 3 hours or 4 hours riding to town with a load of wheat. You come there and the elevator manager says, "Oh, our bin for number 1 is full. We've got some room in the number 3 bin if you want to sell it for that, or else you can go back home."
Yeah.
Well, this is a far cry from the world today, where you wake up in the morning and your phone is binging with all the grain offers that are out there and who's buying this and what's happened if it rained in Kazakhstan or not and everything. This is not the 1920s, not the 1930s, not even the 1950s, but we still have these institutions running us. And don't kid yourself. One of the main reasons, and it's written in the book and it's cited, one of the main reasons that the Wheat Board was given power over marketing of wheat was in both world wars. When the Brits, and Canada was still a colony, the Brits ordered Canada to secure supplies of wheat, stop any kind of speculating or hoarding, control the price, and supply Great Britain with wheat during both wars. And I quoted in my book a book written by Mitchell Sharp, and it's in my book, where he worked in the grain industry, grain bureaucracy in Ottawa at the time, and he said it was not the lobbying efforts of the wheat pools or anything; it was the supply of wheat for Britain that caused us to make that decision in 1943. So that's a bit of it's a long-winded summary, but that's what it was. So we continued on the journey. And if you take, there's basically, I guess it's 6 components in this system. There would be farmers, there would be the government, there's the wheat board, there's the government bureaucracy, there's the railroads and the grain companies. And I worked in 5 of those components, if I got the number right here. The only place I didn't work was for the railroad. So I got to see how each one of these players functioned and how it affect their bottom lines, especially when you get down into at the board level and you see all these decisions and things that the wheat board's doing, which many times were punitive against grain companies that spoke out against the wheat board. And then at the time, I was always a farmer. That was our main activity. We lived on the farm. So I saw it from so many perspectives. And then during the COVID winter, when I was sitting at home, we didn't go down to Arizona. And I said, I got to do something this winter. And I decided I'm going to write this story.
Yeah, well, a lot of us are glad you did. A comment from a buddy of mine the other day was, these stories need to be recorded or they get forgotten or they get lost. And I think it's a very powerful book for, us, my generation, the generations behind me, and future generations. If you don't know what happened in the past, you're bound to repeat it, I think is the quote. So.
Exactly. And that was part of it. Spending a winter, and I like to stay busy. And I said, if we don't write this story, it's going to get lost. Or if someone else is going to write it from their perspective, no, I want to be first mover. I want to get it out there from my perspective. I'm a believer in personal freedom. I'm a believer in entrepreneurship, in innovation, in people doing things for themselves. I'm not a believer in big government, controls, bureaucracy, red tape, those stymie development. And I think there's a number of things that come out from this book now as I do podcasts and have interviews and people sending me emails. This book really highlights how the East has treated the West subserviently. These institutions that are basically run by the liberal Laurentian elites in Ottawa and Ontario and Quebec, much like the Wheat Board, they control the West and keep us as a colony. We have it right now. We can't develop our oil. We can't develop our industries. Everywhere we turn, there's somebody wants to stop us from doing this, that, or the other thing. And also, I think it reflects the Canadian way of choosing security over innovation. And that's a somewhat, I'll say, lazy way of doing things because we allow other people to jump ahead of us and take control. And that's exactly where we've ended up with the United States. Canadians have not been aggressive enough as business people. We've been in the West, even when we try, we can't do things, as we see right now in the pipeline debate. And we've allowed, inadvertently, through the back door, the Americans control our economy. They control our defense systems. The West is just, we have so many resources in a worldwide context, the fresh water, the arable land, the forestry, the potash, the coal, the energy resources, and we can't develop them. And we can't even pay for our own defense share in NATO. What have we done? We've just let the Americans walk in and do it. So here's a story of where a number of Canadian citizens decided, over a 35-year period, mind you, that we were going to take some of our freedoms back and we weren't going to take it anymore.
That's how long you were involved in that fight. It was 35 years then?
Well, 1979, the first letter went to Don Mazinkowski, and the last meeting I had was end of July 2015 when the wheat board was wound down. So what does that come to? 15 and 31? Yeah, I think somewhere around 21. Yeah, somewhere around 35, 36 years. And my last words when I left the last wheat board meeting in Winnipeg in July of 2015, where now I can go home and make some money growing wheat. And we did.
Well, that whole fight was really, well, I had really strong influences about anti-wheat board, and we had two newspapers that came every week. My father and mother, they, had probably still have a subscription to the Western Producer, right? But my favorite was the United Grain Growers. It was the Grain News, I guess
Great
it was
news.
called. Yeah, and that was the one I resonated with the most, and
Yeah.
I had a lot of strong influences. So we were half an hour from the Alberta border, and I remember, and I learned this when I felt this when I was driving truck in the early '90s, going in southern Alberta, and I remember talking to Buck Spencer one night
Yeah.
unloading grain, and I said, "Why are Albertans so different than Saskatchewan people?" Because we were half an hour away,
Mm-hmm.
but there was certainly in southern Alberta, this just a air of entrepreneurship that I didn't feel around back home, right? But so we were half an hour from that border, and do you remember when it was illegal to grow grain in Saskatchewan and truck it to feedlots in Alberta?
Yes, there's reference
Yeah.
to that in my books, where the wheat board controlled interprovincial traffic,
Yeah.
interprovincial shipments of grain. So you couldn't ship grain from Saskatchewan to Alberta without wheat board permission.
Yeah, and that got opened up from a neighbor, family friend of ours. He's passed away now at Raymond Somerville.
Uh-huh.
So went to the Supreme Court of Canada because when you think about it, you can't haul grain 20 miles from your farm.
Well, that's bureaucracy out of control. Who's
Yeah.
entrenched bureaucracy? Their interests are self-preservation and power. Not They don't care anything about what they were originally meant to do, and they've outgrown their usefulness, and they've lost their focus, and they became empire builders, and somebody had to rein them in. And that's the problem with starting government agencies, because every government comes in, well, we're going to start another agency, we're going to do this to help you, we're going to do that to help you, but nobody shoves any out the back door. So they just pile up and pile up and pile up, and you just got scores of bureaucrats running around Ottawa. Some of them don't even know what they're doing.
I have some theories of some of the incentives might have been to keep the wheat board monopoly as a monopoly buyer of grain. I called it. Maybe there's a better term for that.
No.
But what do you think the incentives were at that time? I guess after the wheat board was left, I think more grain went to the West Coast, didn't it, after the wheat board monopoly left? But what were some of the incentives, do you think, would have been to keep that institution in place for all those years?
Well, first of all, just to reference the West Coast shipments, over time, as the Port of Vancouver grew, more and more grain went westward because it was so expensive to go through Thunder Bay. There were so many transshipments and the seaway, and then they were closed in the winter. But again, let's come back. You can come back to my story about farmers hauling grain with sleighs and horses. And there was a time when the grain companies and the railroads abused their power. You go to the court cases at Saint-Luda, the Canada Grain Act, and there were all of these populist movements that started. The Grain Growers of Canada, the forerunner of UGG, and then the big wheat board movement, or wheat pool movement, I should say, in the 20s. And this was a populist approach rooted in cooperatism, which becomes kind of a socialism, where you lose your freedoms, but you act together. And all of these institutions grew and supported each other. The wheat board supported the pool movement supported the wheat board. And they became a self-fulfilling circle here. They had so much power and influence. They were able to set quotas. They were able to, the wheat board was able to move grain deliveries and shipments through the grain companies that they chose. So who did they give it to? The wheat board. So that was really a quasi-socialist mentality that I don't believe in. You referenced the Canadian or the United Grain Growers and Grain News. They were a farmer-owned grain company, but they believed in marketplace solutions to the problems, not centrally managed systems. And I think over time has proven that you're not going to create a lot of wealth in a socialist system because everybody is not equal. Some people can do things better than others, And if you hinder their ability to do these things, you eventually stymie the whole progress of the economy and innovation, finding new ways to do things where people can use their skills to make profit centers out of more activities other than just growing wheat. They can spend winter trying to market it. And then this became entrenched. The wheat board was given the power. No government would ever take them on. And we ended up in this gridlock with this very, very powerful institution. Nobody was investing money in the railroads. The grain companies weren't investing money in facilities. The system wasn't working. But yet, we couldn't change the wheat board. So we had to just keep building and building and building. And then, how do you do? There was numerous studies. Any studies that were commissioned by non-wheat board were never allowed access to the wheat board books. Then the wheat board would do a study claiming all these things, and they would allow the writers of that study access to their books. The bottom line is there was no totally conclusive reasoning. Nobody could prove that the wheat board system was getting farmers more grain, and certainly at the price of losing individual abilities to run your own business.
Yeah, and I think that's so. The last little comment really is so important. I mean, you can't control your cash flows. I was speaking to a university class here a couple months ago, and I was explaining to them, trying to help them understand what the system was like. It's a government policy class. You had the quota system, and you get paid a percentage of what that small quota would be, and this black book of what you might receive in the future, right? And if at all. And I remember talking to guys at breakfast in the morning, saying, I would grow grain. I need cash flow. I need to raise X number of dollars in a short period of time here, and I will sell. I want the ability to sell for 15 or 10 cents a bushel less than you to manage my business.
That's right. It's impossible to do any kind of a reasonable budget projection with the wheat board quota system. You don't know what the quota is going to be, when you're going to get to deliver it, what the price is going to be that you'll eventually get it, and you sell the grain you grow the grain in the summer of whatever it was, 1980, and you won't get a final payment till January of 1982. How do you run a business?
Yeah. You touched a little bit earlier about the influence of the wheat pools, and I'm assuming it was very similar in Alberta, but there was a lot of they called it the social gospel back in the day.
Yeah.
And by the Saskatchewan wheat pool, you can tell now. I wasn't a wheat pool fan. You could probably tell by that statement, and there was so much fear of the unknown, so much fear of the unknown of what.
Yes.
And it was just fear mongering, and I don't know. It was. I remember because I was young and came out of university and probably a little cocky, maybe a bit obnoxious. Probably knew more than I knew more then than I know now. If it tells you anything, but you'd be in the coffee shop or the beer parlor, and and this is a very important issue to me. But people didn't understand. They were so scared. They just went with the flow. It was just being passive might be a word for it. Subservient, and you were a lone wolf. So I felt like I was a lone wolf in the late 90s, early 2000s. Like there wasn't very many people who were vocal about this because the pressure to stick with the system was from your neighbors, I felt was very high. You were doing this in the 70s and the 80s. What was that like?
Well, when you went to many meetings, you kept your car running and pointed outside of town. But there were many people, and they were all spread out. And probably we must all give credit to what was then the Palliser Wheat Growers Association, because they were the first one to say the emperor had no clothes in the early 70s. right in when the grain glut was the worst, 70, 71. And then there were all these individual people, and you get involved with the wheat growers, and you see a guy there and a guy there and a lady there, and we all think the same way. And so we started working, and then the Western barley growers were formed. And so we formed this loose coalition of commodity groups and farmers, and many of them, again, that I've worked with and just cherished their friendships. And we were through the trenches. So there were people, and everybody was getting so disgusted with the system. And many of us were, just too stubborn to quit. We were going to make it better. We saw the light. We just had to keep at it. And we know we were fighting. Sask Wheat Pool was, and again, I mentioned some of this in my book, and I think it was a quote from one of the first Alberta Wheat Pool presidents that, the wheat pool movement was more of a religion than a business venture or something to that effect. And it was a way of life. And I know I read in Sask Pool exactly what you said. I read some of the history books of Sask Pool, and they would go to all these little towns. These little towns in the 40s and 50s, and no good communications. And they would create the social event. It would be the Sask Wheat Pool Supper, and it would give a reason for all the farm wives to dress up and come to town and visit with their neighbors, and they'd show a film, and they'd have somebody saying how great. So it became more of a way of life. But again, it comes back to this thing, the Canadian way, where we are afraid of change, and we're more willing to choose security over opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's where I think that title of your book is so powerful. The culture. The wheat pool had a very strong culture about it.
Oh, yes.
I went to the hockey rink on Sunday, and I walked in the door with this referee, and he was older than me, and he had a Sask Wheat Pool hat on. They haven't had those hats for, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, right? Maybe
Yeah.
that is an old hat. It is a blue, one was a teal blue one, so it was an old thing. But yeah, that's still a thing, right?
There are vestiges of it, but I think by and large, when you start getting from my age and certainly down into your age group, people aren't looking back. They're on with it. They're happy running their businesses. You can argue about the price of grain and all these things and what's happening internationally, but the wheat board and the wheat pools had no control over that anyway.
No.
Those are all international events. So,
Well, I had a friend of mine, he told me this a couple months ago when I started my podcast. He said, Trent, don't be talking too much about the Canadian Wheat Board. Nobody cares anymore.
yeah,
And maybe he's right. I don't know. But the thing is, my podcast is for me.
yeah.
I don't. The audience can maybe they like it, maybe they don't. It doesn't really matter. But I think I just think one of my fears is this: that if there is a global hot conflict, World War III, if it hasn't started already, and I don't know. You start seeing nations start coveting their resources. I think I have this idea that we could start seeing that around the world, where exports of resources are under government control again in event of a hot conflict.
Well, we don't know what we don't know. Anything's possible, obviously, certainly with people like Putin running amok. But I'm going to come back to something you said, and I have that quote in my book too, that those who don't know their history are destined to repeat it. So this story was not written. This is written and referenced. It was categorized as historical nonfiction. I've referenced many books I've written. So if we want to go back there, at least we have a reference to how well that last one worked.
Right.
And what
Yeah,
some of the
absolutely.
shortcomings and the pitfalls were. We don't know what the future is going to bring, but at least let's know our history.
I agree with you. That's why I think it's so important to have that book out. Yeah, it's you look back on it, it's just hard to imagine that it just lasted as long as it did. And, well, if it wasn't for people like you fighting, Who knows, right? If no
Well,
one's putting up a fight, it's going to continue.
again, there were lots of us. I just happened to be one that was maybe more vocal than others. And once I started writing the book and I reached out to some of these people, and I didn't think I'd ever make it as far as I did with the book, but I had such encouragement from so many people that I'd worked with to just keep going. And they would read my drafts and offer solutions. And I also used them for fact checking because a lot of that was from my memory, my personal notes, and the people that were there with me at these meetings and the activities, what the wheat board did and what the pools would do, anything to maintain control. I mean, I used to work for the Grain Transportation Authority, a federal government body in the early 80s. And the wheat pool tried to get me fired. The wheat board tried to get me fired. I would never stand there as a government employee preaching freedom, but afterwards over a beer, I'm on my own here. I'm going to tell you what I think.
Right, right. Yeah, that must have been an interesting, we touched on it in the book there. There were some pressures, in Winnipeg to stay in line and toe the party line and
Huge.
yeah. Yeah, like so and maybe I don't know how far you want to go into this but I mean,
Sorry, my phone's ringing here. There, it's on silent.
grain prices probably went up here, so we're getting a phone call.
Beep. Or else your stop losses got tripped.
Yeah, maybe it's a margin call, eh?
That can wait.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm just thinking back to some of the reading your book there and so when the Canadian Wheat Board started having farmer directors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we had, well, it's Ken Ritter. He was nominated and elected in our area. And under the platform, it ran under the platform as open market, anti-wheat board monopoly. I just forget exactly what it was, but that's how I voted for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it wasn't very long after being in Winnipeg as a director, he ended up being the chair of the board.
Yes.
And his tune had changed, and he wasn't the only one. There's a few others too.
Yeah.
And I always I understand it's very difficult to you need to have strong conviction or strong beliefs in your convictions and a strong fortitude to stay and still keep fighting or standing up for what you believe in. But I was always confused. What happened? I don't know if you want to answer this or get into it or speculate.
I got into it in my book, and it goes back even further. Before there was an elected board of directors, there was 5 commissioners who were appointed by the government to run the wheat board. And these were mostly patronage types of, and there were 2 commissioners that were appointed. One was by Otto Lang and one was by Brian Mulrooney. And they were appointed because they had spoken, their persona was questioning the status quo of the wheat board. One was Forrest Hetland, a very progressive farmer from northern part of Saskatchewan. I forget the town. He was one of the fellows that got the whole canola industry going, the canola councils, the canola growers. When there was a plebiscite on canola marketing, he was in favor of keeping canola off the wheat board. Then once he became appointed commissioner, I just used the term, he drank the Kool-Aid. It's a very cushy, powerful job. You travel internationally, you travel first class. You're in such control where you go. You meet with diplomats all over. And they kind of began to like the job. And don't forget, many of these people did not get there by executive ability. They were political appointees. So where were they going to go next? Forrest drank the Kool-Aid. Then in the early 80s, an opening arose, and I was close to this one because I was involved a little bit in the recommendation there because I still worked for Don Mazinkowski off and on. I knew him. There was an appointment came up, Lauren Hayne, standing up there at the podium in front of the United Grain Growers and the meetings and the press, talking about changes to the wheat board, freedom for barley marketing, all of this stuff. Lauren gets appointed. He's the strongest advocate you could find for the wheat board. Drank the Kool-Aid again. Loved his perks. Lauren never, he was president of the UGG, which said one thing, and then he went to the wheat board, he turned. And then the man that I'll respect a tremendous amount was Ken Beswick. Ken Beswick came out of Alberta, again, a farmer, well-educated. He was appointed to the wheat board by the Mulroney government as well. And again, I had a bit of a hand to play in the background there. When Ken went, and he would not change his convictions, and the other 4 commissioners basically froze him out of everything. He was ostracized. The executives would not consult him. They wouldn't forget to invite him to meetings. They wouldn't invite him to the Christmas party. He was just ostracized, left out, and he was a commissioner. He was left out of all dealings because he would question things. So that's what somebody would face when they came into the wheat board and started questioning things. And then when we went to an election, of course, we come back to this business. The pools just ramped up their whole publicity and ensured that they would get wheat board supporters on the board. And you couldn't get enough people on there there was a few, usually from Alberta, the odd one from Saskatchewan. And then there were guys like Rod Flamen and Ken who got elected on one platform and turned when they were there. I called him out and I talk about it. And poor Ken Beswick just left. We were good friends. He left in total disgust and dismay. And he left the country. He went to Costa Rica and he started a teak farm. And shortly after that, he got cancer and he died. He stuck to his convictions. The others just folded because, man, I like traveling first class.
Yeah, it was so disappointing. And I didn't, I think Ritter was down there, Ken Ritter was down there, felt like 2 weeks, and all of a sudden he was appointed chairman of the board. Were you on the board at that time when he was?
No, I wasn't. That was the early one. The members elect the chairman.
Yeah.
And again, I think the power went to his head because the majority of directors of the wheat board were pro single desk. They wanted to preserve the wheat board. And Ken had other ambitions. He was a lawyer. He was a well-educated fellow, but he wanted to be chairman.
Yeah, I speculate that, he played his hand well out there. And then it would have been then to have a chairman as a person who converted would be good for the optics of the Canadian wheat board monopoly. So
yeah. So that was part of the Kens. I mean, there was Ken Beswick, and he stayed with his convictions, and unfortunately he died early of a brain tumor. And interestingly enough, and it's maybe a morbid thing, but Ken Beswick, after he resigned and left the wheat board, he got brain cancer and died of it. So I'm looking back, I say, my name's Ken, I'm at the wheat board. I'm not sure I want to stay here. This wheat board power goes way beyond just marketing grain.
I was told the Canadian wheat board, when the monopoly got imposed, maybe it was only when it was created in 36. I think when the monopoly got imposed in 43, it eliminated 500 jobs from the private grain sector, and when 70 years later, when it lost its monopoly and I guess folded or closed down, there's 500 jobs lost then too. So it just shuffled jobs around basically at the end of the day.
Well, they came in at 500 jobs. They had 500 employees. But this was an era where everything was done manually. There were no computers. If this these activities and responsibilities were still in the private trade, they would have to shake them down because they couldn't afford to keep them all. Well, the wheat board was a bureaucracy. They never got rid of anybody. They just took it out of the pool account and they kept all their employees. So even when they computerized and did everything, they still had the same number of people. They had
Yeah.
no discipline of the marketplace in a bureaucracy like that.
There's really no accountability.
No accountability.
What role do you think the Canadian Wheat Board played in foreign relations? Buying favor, supporting democracies around the world. Were the Saskatchewan or the Western Canadian farmers selling their grain for less to the Canadian Wheat Board basically buying democracy or buying favor?
Well, I don't know. I can only speculate. First of all, I think the wheat board's self-promotional speech in Western Canada made them sound a lot more influential and important than they really were in the international context. There was a lot of people from the grain trade who were traders who said wheat board was just, they would just roll over. They were not aggressive marketers or whatever. They were the only place you could get Canadian wheat, and they were not good traders. They were bureaucrats. Nobody could ever judge them, because how do you judge them against the world where there is no control, as you would have, like a control feature? What would happen if we didn't have the wheat board? Because we do. So again, when everybody tried to study them, nobody outside the wheat board could ever get access to the wheat board books. And then the wheat board would do them, claiming all these things, because the authors had access to this information. On the international stage, I think Western farmers did not fare well. And I think the wheat board claimed to be much more important than they ever were.
Yeah. I spent more time than I probably should have trying to understand what the incentives would be to maintain that monopoly in place by the federal government. And, I just can't, unsupported, unsubstantiated, just speculation that it was used as a good political tool. But in
well,
situations,
there was a lot of opposition or concurrence with the wheat board in the West. So it became political. Nobody wanted to take that one on. And then even when the West was all going conservative, like in the Mulroney era, and I lived it. I worked for Don Mazinkowski. I mean, many of his strongest supporters were wheat board supporters and wheat pool supporters. So the Mulroney government wasn't going to take it on. But as time passed and we entered into the Harper era, it had moved a long way. Plus, a number of Harper's involvement in the National Citizens Coalition and the Reform Party. And there's a couple of people in particular that did a good job of briefing him in those two venues. That was Paul Orsak, who's a common name in the industry. Paul was a farmer from Manitoba, and Russ Crawford worked in the grain industry in Alberta. And both of these were early Reform Party supporters, National Citizenship Coalition members, and they got to know Harper well, and he did not like what he saw. And sure enough, when he got in, as soon as he could, he started to try to change the wheat board. And my goodness, thank goodness he did, because in today's world, we'd probably still be stuck with it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that happened around that time in North American agriculture. It'd be a rough place to be, I think, right now with the wheat board. So Harper became prime minister. Jerry Ritz became the ag minister.
Yeah.
And I remember, I don't study politics or really follow it that closely, but it took them a few years. They needed to get a majority government, I think, didn't they? And
well, that's the problem. They kept getting minority government. So they did what they could do, but the war was on, because the Liberals and the NDP, of course, were never going to discuss the wheat board, and it had to be changed by an act of parliament. So with minority governments, there's no way Harper could ever got it through. It would have just become a fight. So he did everything he could. There were 10 elected farmer directors, 5 appointed by the government. He removed the 4 liberals And the CEO, who was a board member, who was a very pro-wheat board guy, he put in place, that's where I was the first one, Bruce Johnson, Glenn Findlay from Manitoba, former ag minister, then eventually Dave Carefoot. But that was only 5. And then we had 2 of the 10 elected farmers who wanted to change the wheat board. That gave us 7. So just about every vote was 8-7.
Oh, yeah.
So he couldn't do anything until he got a majority. When he got the majority, the first act of parliament they passed was the Freedom of Grain Marketing Act.
Yeah. Yeah, I got lucky. Prime Minister Harper and Jerry Ritz, they came out to Art Waldy's farm south of Kindersley.
Right.
And I got Robin, Art's son, invited me out to that event, and that was quite something, right? Big. I was out of farming by that time, but it was certainly a
Yeah.
big event. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
yeah, well, yeah. The story is like, yeah, I remember there was Farmers for Justice. There
Yeah.
were all sorts of groups that were. It was interesting.
So true. Well, the momentum was building.
Yeah.
Building.
Yeah, he started getting those court cases and
Yeah.
those sentences that were bizarre, really by any
Yeah.
stroke of the imagination, and certainly brought attention.
Time was moving on. The information age was there. Younger farmers were taking over the farms from their fathers and grandfathers. They had different views on the wheat board. They wanted some freedom. It was just a matter of amassing that support and keeping that snowball rolling.
Yeah, I think the internet played a part of that. I remember going to the coffee shop in the morning for breakfast, and I'd have the price of grain. I could get,
Yeah.
I'd say everywhere in the world, but it wasn't quite that way, but it was pretty close, right?
Yeah.
And the information, you didn't have to go to the elevator to get the information anymore. And yeah, it
Yeah.
was interesting. So I never had the passion, dedication, or the conviction to, and it's probably too selfish, to not really spend time on pursuing something outside of the business that I was in. For example, I never, I didn't join political organizations. I didn't join, as you did, the United Grain Growers as a delegate. That took some time. That took some time away from your business, time away from your family. Then you spent time in Ottawa, right?
Yes.
That and you did that. You say 35 years.
Well, between the various entities, we worked on that battle for 35 years.
Like, that takes a lot of dedication. A lot of people would have just thrown their hands up.
There were so many good people in that same era, in the same wavelength of what we wanted to do. And there was so much support and encouragement. And I guess my stubbornness came out here. I said I was not going to let them get the best of me. And I was in a unique position. I was well connected politically because of my past. Once you work in a minister's office, it's amazing how many doors get open to you, because, especially with parties that are in power, like in Alberta. I mean, I was always very close to the Alberta government politicians. I was on advisory committees. I could get meetings with the premier and ministers because I worked so I became a bit of a conduit for all the people out in the country, and we were all farmers. I was a farmer. Number one, I was not sitting there as a bureaucrat or looking for a job or looking to get a seat around at the commissioner's table so I could travel first class. I just believed, and there was a lot of people. Eventually, these people said, well, you can't quit. It was Paul Earle, a long time. He spent his career in the grain industry. He used to say, I got to get the quote right. And he said, it is an actual quote. He says, I can't remember it right now. It's something about the only thing that's needed for evil to prevail is for good men to remain silent.
Yeah.
And, I don't want to overblow that, but that's true. If you just sit back and let somebody else keep doing it, you got nobody to blame.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, yeah, 35 years, it's a long time.
We
yeah,
got
and
her done.
yeah, absolutely. And I suppose when you had your farm as a business, and yeah, that it probably it probably had its it probably had to take second place at some point. Or your farm had to probably, or
We
probably suffer a
juggled.
little bit.
We
Yeah,
juggled a lot. We juggled a lot. My wife would fill in when I wasn't around. She had her own career as a nurse. We had 4 children. We juggled. That was one of the reasons I wanted to write my book, so my kids would know why I never was home for so many years. But and now one of our daughters and one of our son-in-laws runs the farm. We're still an active going concern. They're doing very well. The farm is growing. So we managed to keep that farm moving through another generation. It's now gone on.
did your kids have any idea prior to reading the book?
Well, it's probably just plain human nature. They know I was there doing something, but they had their own pursuits, especially when they were at home. Right now, very much so, as they're in their 40s and in their careers. And once I started writing it, I had huge support from them to just keep doing it,
Yeah, that's
finish.
great. That's great. Well, I got a few things. You mentioned a book, a couple books. Your book, I've been recommending it to people. Is there any other literature on the subject that would complement your book that you would recommend?
Well, there's a list of further reading, which is a lot of books in my books, too many to mention. But you can find out all about my book on my website, which is Culture of Control, and you
Yeah.
can get an email to me directly through using
Okay.
that Culture of Control website. Books are available on Amazon. I have them for sale on my own. You can get them from Friesen Press. Um, so wait, I lost my train of thought here. What was the question again?
Well, just other like books that would
Oh,
like your
okay.
book's incredible. So
Yeah.
yeah, like I always recommend Merchants of Grain by Dan Morgan.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's one of them. Probably the one book, if you're going to read any book, it's a very interesting story and a good read. It's Russ Crawford wrote this, and it's called Limit Up. And it's a historical fiction of the Soviet Great Grain Robbery, which changed the whole world grain industry after that. After the Soviets came and brought up all the surplus grain in North America in 1972. And from June of 1972 to September of 1973, the price of grain tripled in the world. And that caused food inflation. And then on top of that, if you remember, well, you wouldn't remember, but history will tell, we had the American oil embargo from the Arabs. So energy went way up. And that was the root cause. When you have two Maslow's hierarchies, basic needs, food and shelter, energy and food, when they triple in price or more, you create inflation. And that set off that big round of inflation in the 70s, which eventually ended up with 18-20% interest rates. So there's that one, and it's called Limit Up by Russ Crawford. It's on Amazon. There's a very good book by Pierre Burton. He's got several good books. There's one about, I think he calls it The Great Railroad or something.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And there's books on the on Sask Wheat Pool, the Canadian Wheat Board. There's a number of them. Most of these are out of print. I collected them over my lifetime, so I have quite a library. But Merchants of Grain is a good one about the concentration of grain traders. Very powerful, and again, they're still there in the
Yeah.
internationally. But the Limit Up was really a good book. I just can't remember all the others. They said there's quite a few of them.
Well, and your book, yeah. Just get back to your book too. I remember a buddy of mine. I saw him on X, on formerly Twitter. He picked up your book and he started reading it and stayed up till 3 a.m. reading it. And then I read it after that. It's a great book. And the 70s was interesting. So you had that Russian grain robbery, and they actually were buying U.S. grain, and that was subsidized by the U.S. government.
Well, we'd gone through so many years of surplus supply in grain that the Americans were using export subsidies to try to get rid of particularly soybeans at the time. So what had happened is the Soviets had 2 years of back-to-back droughts. And in 1972, they realized on the second year of the drought, they would not have enough wheat to feed their people. So it was export chleb. And if you take that into Ukrainian, export chleb is chleb. Chleb is bread in Ukrainian or Russian. Export chleb turned into import chleb. They sent the same people and they sent them to the Americans, and they started quietly, surreptitiously meeting with the main grain traders one by one, always saying, don't tell anybody else. And they met with the wheat board one by one. And the traders were putting in for export subsidies on these sales. And before it all became public, everybody woke up one morning and realized the Soviets had bought up all the excess supply of grain in North America.
Yeah.
The
And
book explains it well.
Yeah, it does. And after that, the export reporting came in the United States.
Yes, it showed a lot of flaws in the system they had. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this point I'll bring up about oil too really highlights the importance of having an open market. So we saw what happened, I would say, with the demise of the Canadian Wheat Board. I remember looking at it. The day the Canadian Wheat Board lost their monopoly was the first time ever, I think, a farmer in Saskatchewan got the same price as a farmer in North Dakota, right?
Yeah.
And
What
Ontario.
arbitrage? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that oil price and the boom, I think that a lot of that was, my understanding was attributed to is it Mark Rich or Mark Reich? I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he created the spot price for oil.
I don't know that story. But I mean, oil was in the doldrums forever. And that all spinning out of all of that was, we have a whole new world of how these commodities are traded, and new power sources like the Arab bloc and so forth with OPEC. And a lot of that was formed in the 70s, or it started out moving forward in the 70s.
Yeah, prior to that, it was in the oil, regarding oil, it was basically long-term contracts with sovereign nations.
Yeah,
and
fixed.
And then it became a spot price, and all of a sudden, just like the Canadian Wheat Board had a spot price for wheat all of a sudden in Etonia, Saskatchewan, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Price of grain goes up.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to leave with the audience?
I think I've covered things fairly well from my perspective, and you've asked the right questions. I read the book. There's a lot there. I'm pleased the way it turned out. The story's there now for history. I appreciate getting interviewed by yourself and anywhere you can. So don't check out I'm not going to make any money publishing a book, but it's important that the story be told.
Yeah, and Ken, I was impressed how well written it was.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. I didn't know what to expect, right?
Yeah.
And it was certainly I was impressed with it, so it was good. Can you identify a formative event in your life that really shaped who you are today?
Oh, that's pretty hard. I just always had, I despised control for the reasons of control. That was just sort of in me. I didn't like that. We grew up, my wife and I we grew up on mixed farms just a few miles away. It was typical of the 60s, not a heck of a lot of money around. We wanted to do better with our lives and make some money. Coming back to writing the book, my wife worked very closely with me on writing that book. She read through that book and edited it so many times that she could probably read it to you out of her mind. And she was a very good critic because she asks a lot of questions. And when I would write it, I'd have a lot of shop talk in there. And she'd say, so what does this mean? I said, well, everybody knows what that means. I said, no, everybody doesn't know what that means. You're in the grain industry, you know. So Wendy helped me. And really, when it went to Friesen, they didn't do much rewriting at all. I'm having trouble just coming up. It was just kind of a building of events. A lot of it was self-confidence. Again, we lived in a very closed, very strong Ukrainian Catholic community where peer pressure was very great. People, everybody sort of stayed there together. People who were outspoken weren't always looked upon well, and I was really a fish out of water over there. But we survived, and it was just kind of constantly. We just wanted to do better. We just wanted to do better. We didn't want to live impoverished and sort of just plug along like our parents did on the farm. There's opportunities out there. Let's go find them. I don't know, cleaning the chicken coop when I was 10 years old instead of going to play hockey like my buddies were doing. I mean, that kind of stuff over and over and over. I said, there's got to be a better way to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, you let off mentioning your wife, and maybe that was a pretty formative event in your life that helped shape who you are today.
Yes, I shouldn't overlook that. I guess that kind of goes without saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've been married. It's our 50th anniversary this year. We have 4 great kids. We've had a tremendous life together. We're both very ambitious people. We're very ambitious people, and we worked hard. We filled in for each other. When one was gone, this and that. Wendy was a nurse for many years. She gave that up just a few years ago as we came to Arizona and started spending winters here. So that was huge. But we were very young when we met. We sort of grew up together in the same years in school, in a small country school, 20 kids in class. And so we spent our lives together, and we supported each other. And I said it kind of goes without saying, you never even think about it. But she was fully supportive in writing this book. And somewhere, I think it's on one of the covers of the books, it said, Friesen said, so this is Motiuk's first book. And Wendy quietly said to me, and your last. So.
Well, she's a great editor.
She was. She was.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, congratulations on the 50 years. That's an accomplishment in itself. And yeah, it sounds like Wendy was a great, just a great lady, and maybe someday I'll get to meet her too. So that's great.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, this has been great, Ken, and thanks a lot for taking time out.
Oh, my pleasure.
And this has been fun. And yeah, I'll make sure I put some links in the notes on the podcast. It'll get distributed across YouTube and Spotify and Apple.
Oh, thank you.
And I'll go out to my newsletter, to everybody on my newsletter list with the link in there too, so they'll find you.
Okay, and people can contact me for further information further. And hey, stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Right on.